but a very important session for the 2019 Munich Security Conference. If we just let the room settle a bit. Syria has been part of the Munich Security Conference since the uprising, the peaceful protests for change began in 2011. Year in, year out, we have discussed the changing dynamics on the ground, such that we meet now, and unfortunately, it has an unfortunate title: the Syrian conflict, strategy or tragedy. I don't need to tell anyone here in this audience or watching the live stream that Syria is already a tragedy. So much has been lost, huge swathes of Syria destroyed, so many lives have been taken away, many people disappeared, and the situation on the ground now leaves many to ask the tough questions about Syria's future. We meet at a time where Syrian security forces are in control of the vast majority of Syrian land. The opposition, and it's largely an extremist opposition, is controlling the last province of Idlib, and there is still a battle against so-called Islamic State. We heard yesterday from the US Vice President, Mike Pence, that there's just a little bit left. And once they can declare the caliphate is over, then American troops will pull out. But Mike Pence told us yesterday that while the troops will be leaving soon, America was not leaving. We have an excellent panel today representing the key players, many of the key players in Syria. And we're also very privileged to have the new UN Special Representative on Syria, Geir Patterson, to update us on the very frustrating but still continuing efforts to try to find a political way out. Let me begin at the very end. Hulusi Akar, who joins us from Turkey, Turkey's Minister of Defense, exactly the right person we'd like to hear from today after the American announcements. His colleague Ilyas Bousab, who's the Minister of Defense for Lebanon, another neighbor of Syria, very concerned, in fact very involved in Syria's future. Ahmed Abul-Ghaith, who is the Secretary General of the League of Arab States and former Foreign Minister of Egypt. Sergei Vershinin fame from Chekhov, he tells me, no relation. Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, the Russian Federation, who is a key ally insofar as efforts to try to resolve many issues in Syria, although on opposite sides of the conflict. James Franklin Jeffrey, who's the Ambassador and Special Representative for Syrian engagement. But since the departure of Brett McGurk, he has a new title, a new hat, which is also taking care of the anti-ISIS efforts. To continue the thread, which we all followed yesterday, let us turn to you first, Ambassador Jeffrey, to ask you. Vice President Pence assured everyone that the United States would continue to fight against the remnants of Islamic State, and of course the United States does continue to play a role in Syria. Where is that policy now? What will be its main components?
Again, to reiterate what the Vice President said, the U.S. policy has not changed towards Syria, let alone towards the Northeast. So let's start with that overall policy. It has three major components, and frankly, it's been pretty much that over the last two administrations. First of all, the enduring defeat of ISIS. Secondly, a political solution to the conflict in Syria that results through UN action in a Syrian government that behaves very differently to its own people and to its neighborhood. Thirdly, the removal of all foreign forces who've entered since 2011, in particular our concern that of Iran, all Iranian-commanded forces from the entirety of Syria. And we think these three goals are intertwined and mutually supporting because the threats that they deal with are all mutually supporting, unfortunately, as well. Now, in the Northeast, we are removing our ground troops because the primary purpose that they were there for, which was to assist local forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in the defeat of ISIS, has largely been accomplished. And our general principle is, particularly with ground forces, not to keep them on when other people can be doing the job. What is the job in the Northeast? Our goals in the Northeast have not changed. They involve, first of all, maintaining the security in that region, which means we're not at all in favor of the regime coming back in, because the regime does not promote stability, it promotes instability, as we've seen in other areas. Secondly, continuing the fight against ISIS, which is now, once the final battle is over in a day or so, against the caliphate, the territorial ISIS presence. We have thousands of ISIS elements scattered about, sleeper cells, minor insurgencies and such, as we saw in the tragic attack in Manbij several weeks ago. And then we also want to take care of the security concerns of our Turkish NATO allies, vis-a-vis, in particular, the SDF, and we're very concerned that the SDF, with whom we fought with, is not mistreated in any new shifting there. But overall, our goals are the same, and we will maintain forces, both our air capability and the ability to respond, in particular, against any threat that comes up from ISIS, including using American forces. So I'll stop there.
So it's a many-pronged strategy of the United States. It's going to put the political focus of trying to find a political way out to the side until we hear from the U.S. Special Representative. But let's focus on what's going to happen next, which is your troops leaving. What do you say to your allies who have openly expressed here? We heard from the French foreign minister, we heard from the German defense minister, Angela Merkel. Your allies are all worried. In fact, the French foreign minister used the term mystified by the way that this is being carried out by the United States. It's leaving them feel nervous that America is leaving precipitously, and certainly it's leaving your allies on the ground, the YPG and the SDF, really worried that of worse to come. So what have you been telling your allies here?
Well, we've been telling them here, and we've been telling them continuously since mid-December, that first of all, this is not going to be an abrupt or a rapid withdrawal. It's going to be an orderly, step-by-step withdrawal. And at each point, at each phase, we're going to look at our underlying goals that I just laid out and ensure that we have means, capabilities, and partners that can carry them out for us. So that's the first thing. And of course, people are always worried whenever there's a change in American policy, because we're a big security player. We are consulting very carefully and very closely with them. If they felt that they weren't consulted enough initially, we are doing our very, very best night and day, believe me, to ensure that they don't feel under-consulted right now, and I suspect that if you ask them, they feel that they're in constant touch with us, because they are.
The defense minister used the expression in together, out together. All in it, at the same time. But we'll leave it for just a moment, because at least if the media reports are true, it was a phone call with President Erdogan, which reassured President Trump that the end of the Islamic State was near, and that, as we heard yesterday, not just from, and the day before, from Vice President Pence, we also heard from Lindsey Graham, that you want your allies to do more, and Turkey, of course, is one. Defense Minister, could you let us know what Turkey plans to do next? The American pullout will begin. Turkey has talked about a safe haven. Safe, keeping who safe from what?
Thank you, Liz. First of all, our main concern, same, before and after the withdrawal of our American colleagues. Because the main issue for us, the safety and the security of our border, and the safety and the security of our people. Along the more than 400 kilometers, we have still experiencing lots of the skirmishes, lots of the violation, harassment coming from the YPG. Day and night we are fighting against them in any way, and this is a great concern all over the country. So this is the main aim, our main goal, to get rid of the YPG. This is the reason. Main reason, even from the decision of Mr. Trump, the withdrawal from that area. Now, after the withdrawal, what we will do? Still, we are working very closely, very carefully with our American friends. We already established a task force 2-3 weeks ago in Washington. They already started to work in detail, and then depending on the needs of the area, we will decide how to deal with it. However, there are some information they are coming out, for instance, on the 30, 40 kilometers, on the pushing the YPG to the south, out of that area to provide the security of the whole the border for the exactly on the 440 kilometers. So this is the main issue. However, while we are doing this, while we are saying this, as usual, as always, we are keeping saying that we are have respect for the territorial and the political integrity of the Syria. So in that sense, there is no doubt. But the main issue I'd like to underline the security and safety of the Turkish border and then the Turkish people. This is the main issue.
I think, I think the United States, Ambassador Jeffries is nodding. I think they accept that Turkey has security concerns. But when Lindsey Graham asks, and it's not just Lindsey Graham asking, that the European countries should send forces, there's even been a suggestion at one point that Arab states could send forces, that is about protecting the YPG, stopping the advance in terms of their objectives of the Syrian Syrian government's military forces, and to stop them from going and negotiating on that side. So their objectives seem to be different from yours. You see them as the threat, they see them as someone who should be protected.
So within this, now again, I'll repeat, sorry, the main issue are the goals, security. So to get rid of the, terrorists, regardless of who they are, the YPG, Daesh, whomever they are. And then while we are doing this, never ever we are aiming to violate any, rights of any of those countries. But at the same time, while we are fighting against the terrorists, never ever we are aiming at the people living over there. While we are getting the security, providing the security and the safety of our border and the people, at the same time we are always working for providing the right conditions for the return of the refugees, many of them living in Turkey, back to their homes.
Yes, but I think there is a fundamental, I think we have to, without going into all the details, a fundamental disagreement about the YPG. They've been allies with the United States, fighting on the front lines against Islamic State. They have addressed your concerns about relations to PKK, the group, the Kurdish group in Turkey that you see as a rival, and you want to distinguish between ethnic Kurds and the Kurds of the YPG. Let's just leave that for the moment, and I want to bring in Elias Boussab, who yesterday did a statement expressing concern as the Minister of Defense of Lebanon about the presence of non-Arab, in fact non-Syrian forces coming into Syria, which of course they're already there. What would be your advice for the best way forward to the security of northern Syria?
Thank you. And I would like to start by saying that this is leaving us with a problem. This is a time bomb. We have witnessed something similar to that in Lebanon, at a time when the Palestinian, the PLO, were present in Lebanon, and then Israel decided to occupy the land of Lebanon to push away the Palestinians from the border. They never left without resistance that took place in Lebanon and forced them out. The same situation is going to be happening right now in Syria. We have the Arab League, and the Arab League should be involved in the political settlement that takes place in Syria. Any zone that we are discussing right now, it's clearly obvious to everybody that the Americans are looking at it from one angle and the Turks are looking at it from a different angle, as you just said. Obviously, there's a misunderstanding on who we're going to put in the safe zone.
So who do you think should be in that safe zone, if anyone should be in that safe zone?
First of all, a political settlement in Syria will decide what should happen. So more talks that include Syria.
But in the meantime, that's not going to happen sadly, it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Nothing's going to happen tomorrow, but I can tell you that if we go from one side and impose a solution in this area, this is going to create another problem that the world will have to deal with. Because it's clear that the Turks are saying they're there to push the Kurds away. The Americans are saying they want protection for the Kurds there. Obviously, this is not resolved. It requires more talks, it requires political solution, and above all, and most importantly, the Arabs should be involved in that solution. And Syria now is a country, whether you agree with the regime or you don't agree with the regime. Any foreign troops that are going to be there on the ground should be discussed with the government of Syria. And my friend from Turkey just said that they're not there to be an occupation or to try and change the situation in the region or to try and impose a solution in that area, but that cannot happen from one side. You need to negotiate with someone, if not the Syrian government, the Arab League. Do they accept that this zone will be controlled by a country that is neighboring to Syria? If not, you're going to expect problems.
So the other option for the YPG, which is a member of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which, for those who don't follow in detail, it's a broad alliance of Arab and Kurdish fighters, but predominantly Kurdish. We do know that there are already talks underway, some secret, some not so secret, with military and political officials in Damascus to make some kind of an agreement which allows the Kurds to stay in that region, and they become the protector rather than the United States or someone else. Is that an option that you would see as the way forward?
Look, we definitely are for a unified Syria. This is a position that the Arab League has taken. And to have a unified Syria, yes, negotiations...
Under the control of the Syrian government as far as you're concerned, or under President Assad's rule, that's what you want to see?
Right now we are dealing with President Assad in Syria. And many countries have reopened their embassies in Syria knowing that this is the situation. Now, I don't want to discuss because there's a difference
I just wanted to see there are a number of options.
Different opinions about that, and the international community is divided about that. But right now, Assad is there, and we have to deal with the situation as it is. We want unified Syria. We want to support Arab land, and we don't want to see Syria divided. If that means the Syrian government right now in Damascus is negotiating with the Kurds for a solution, this is their business. But definitely what we need to look at is moving forward. If we move forward right now with the situation as is, we are creating a new conflict that's not going to end.
Okay,
so we have to depend more and more on a political dialogue to resolve the situation, including everybody, including the Syrian government.
Yes. I mean, you may say, and in some ways you're right, that if the Kurds decide to negotiate with Damascus, it is their business. But one of the tragedies of the Syrian war is that in many ways it's not about Syria anymore. And everyone here on this panel and beyond thinks it's their business what happens in Syria. Let us move to Ahmed Abu Ghaith, since we've heard from Turkey expressing its concerns about its border. We've heard from Ilyas Bousab from Lebanon saying there shouldn't be a non-Arab country having troops on the ground in Syria. You have recently been having to think a lot about Syria, whether to readmit Syria to the Arab League, where it was pushed out, and some believe far too soon, when the protests first began. Where do you stand with what we've already heard from our two speakers about at least in this particular aspect of the Syrian crisis, the best way forward?
Look, Liz, the first principle of the Arab League is to preserve and to protect the territorial integrity of Syria, as well as the territorial integrity of everybody in the region. That is the first order of the day.
But there is no territorial
integrity in Syria. I will
I'm
just starting to elaborate a little bit. The second point is the Arab world, as a matter of principle, we reject foreign forces being applied on our territory without our request. That is the second principle. However, when it comes to the American presence in northern Syria, one would immediately claim that it shouldn't be there. But there are exceptions. And one of the exceptions, in my opinion, is that that presence is helping to stabilize that region of Syria. The Americans now are deciding to withdraw, whether they will really withdraw and the extent of their withdrawal. But in order to ensure that the situation would not worsen after their withdrawal, one should look into how to tackle that complex problem. I think, though we understand where Turkey starts from and the territorial integrity of Turkey and the interests of Turkey, that we are not challenging. But the Turkish troops, it is better for the Turkish troops and for Turkey not to be present at that so-called safe zone, and to allow, as the defense minister of Lebanon, to allow the process itself to take hold, meaning, and there I object to Senator Graham, because Senator Graham, the day before yesterday, calls for the Europeans to apply forces, as if he is asking forces to be put to receive fire from the indigenous population and from certain groups inside Turkey, and to draw people to attack European forces.
You want no new foreign forces to
I want to apply Adana arrangements, and Adana arrangements are there and still there, and they should be activated. What is Adana? You recall in 1998 when the Turkish Republic objected to the presence of the PKK, and they called for Egypt to intervene. Amr Moussa was then the foreign minister as well as President Mubarak, the president. They intervened and they sort of had an arrangement between Syria, Assad regime, or Hafez al-Assad, the president then, and the Turks, whereby the Syrian army is to bear responsibility. Don't forget that Qasd, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds, they are Syrians. They are not people coming out of space. They are Syrians. And these are indigenous forces inside Syria defending themselves against Daesh, against ISIS. So let the Syrian dynamics, whether the regime or Qasd, and there I call on the regime to moderate its positions and to try to show flexibility and try to draw the Turks into their own arrangements, whereby that would help in the political arrangements that it is a dormant arrangement for the time being. I have been following lately so many meetings about Syria without the participation of any Syrian or anybody from the region apart of Turkey and Iran, and each has his own objectives and his own drive.
Okay, well, let's march. So we've got very clear statements there that there should be a Syrian solution to what could be a vacuum of sorts, notwithstanding American assurances, an Arab solution, but we have a very strong statement from Turkey. In fact, President Erdogan in the last days made it absolutely clear that Turkey will not move back from this important priority of the border, and in fact all options, including military, are on the table. I will return to you, Hulusi Akar, in a moment, but let me pick up from what you said, Ahmed Abu Ghaid, because it is the reality of the Syrian conflict, that certainly since 2016, it is Russia, Turkey, and Iran who are the main players in Syria. Russia, of course, the biggest foreign military power, and one could argue the biggest outside political actor. You've been listening now. We want to you don't want to focus just on that corner of northeastern Syria because it's a bigger issue. You've just had a meeting, yet another meeting in Sochi, to talk about trying to find a way forward. There's also what's happening in Idlib, the last province in the northwest, which is under the control of the opposition. First, a comment on where you see this particular dilemma, and then a little bit broader about the next moves forward. And leave aside the political, because we'll bring Geir to bring,
Thank you. I am told that there is Russian translation, so I will speak Russian.
Yes, okay. Russian, yeah.
Wait for everybody to wear his earphones.
ما بتحكيش روسي؟
Well, I listened attentively to everything that was said before me, and I share a lot of the opinions. And you've just said that recently a summit took place in Sochi between Iran, Russia, and Turkey. And this was a very timely summit. And we had a very good and fruitful discussions, and good decisions were made. This interaction in Syria, well, between Syria, Russia, and Turkey, is an interaction which is a very fundamental one, and we meet on a regular basis. We call it the Astana format, and this coordination is really needed. In Syria today, we see a lot of positive shifts. We see more stability. And of course, there are hotbeds of terrorist activities, and there are pockets of terrorist activity. Mostly it's the area to the east of the Euphrates River. And we talked today about very serious issues pertaining to the situation after the U.S. withdraws from Syria if it implements this plan. I share the opinion pronounced by everybody here. We have to respect the sovereignty, the independence, and the integrity and unity of Syria. We talked about this everywhere. President Putin and President Trump stated this in Da Nang. It was stated in New York and in all the other statements within the Astana format. This is the key. This is the basis for everything that follows. If we manage to preserve the respect to the integrity of Syria, we'll be able to resolve all the problems, including those of security. We talked about the Turkey vision of this. We understand the concern of Turkey about its security. This concern is grounded in Syria and in Turkey, and this security can be guaranteed without any damage to the sovereignty of Syria. We talked here about previous agreements and arrangements, the ones between Syria and Turkey, the Adana agreements and arrangements. I would put it this way. The potential of the Adana Agreement of 1998 may be used in order to satisfy the concerns of Turkey and Syria about their own security. This, however, should be done on the basis of the respect towards the integrity and sovereignty of Syria. What will happen after the U.S. withdraws from Syria? If there are no foreign troops on the ground of Syria in its northeastern part, I think that the best solution would be to start up a dialogue between the Kurds and Damascus. The Kurds are a part of the population of Syria. Kurds have been living and are living in Syria now. Of course, we know about the problems between Damascus and the Kurds. But I think there is a solution through dialogue. We support this dialogue between Damascus and the Kurds. As far as the situation on the ground, we see that the increasing stability leads us to the need for a breakthrough as far as the political arrangement is concerned. This should be supported by all the Syrians and by the international community. You mentioned Idlib. Idlib is a huge problem, and concentrates the most of the terrorists on its territory. Our position, the position of Russia, of the international community, is not to negotiate with terrorists. We should fight them, but we should do this without damaging the civilian lives. Is it possible? Yes, it is. In September, we came up with a joint memorandum between Turkey and Russia. It is in force, and it fulfills very earnest, very important problems. And we usually say that it is very hard to implement. We are talking here about the interaction between the Russian-Turkish interaction vis-à-vis Idlib. We're talking about relations with Iran and about counteracting terrorist organizations. And we said that 90% of Idlib is under control. This is a different situation now. Our main problem, our main task, is to get rid of terrorist hotbeds in Idlib. We should do it in such a way as to protect the civilian population. Thank you.
Syria, that, this week we're focusing on the imminent departure, whether it's weeks or months, of the American forces in the northeast, and that, as we've been discussing, concerns about what happens to American allies on the ground. And we mustn't also forget the concerns about the rise of Islamic State, that the caliphate, or the self-declared caliphate, may be ending, it is ending, but their presence and the powerful pull of their ideas will just go underground. But let's move that further thing. But next week it could be Idlib. President Putin, after your meeting in Sochi, says we're going to take some unspecified steps to clear what he called a hotbed of terrorists. Now this deal with Turkey. Since September, Turkey has been tasked to help create a demilitarized zone and to pull away the extremist groups from Idlib to avoid the kind of another, devastating assault on Idlib, where, let's bear in mind, 3 million people live in Idlib. Half of them are people who've been displaced again and again in the war, and there is great concern, and I'm sure, gentlemen, you would all share it, of another humanitarian crisis. So Turkey hasn't been able to pull out those extremists. In fact, the extremists, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, linked to al-Qaeda, are even stronger. They control now the province. So what do you say to the Russians? What will you do on that side, close to your border?
Thank you. Within the Idlib issue, we are working with our Russian colleagues very closely. And as he mentioned, since September, we already started to implement one of those, plan, let's say plan, MOU. And in that, we made and then we are making every effort to remove all of those, the radical groups from those, the escalation zone, including some of the heavy weapons. But at the same time,
maybe just take your headphones, because it's because it's you can hear it on the microphone. Yes, thank you.
So at the same time, we are along with some of those, the Free Syrian Army and the opposition. Those guys, they're helping us while we are, pushing the radicals from the de-escalation zone. But as you said, as we all are aware of that, this is not so easy job. And they are not in coordination with the Russians. We are trying to do our best.
But Russia's patience seems to have run out. I don't know.
Yeah.
You said it's non-military. What else can you do? Besiege the whole area? How will you get rid of those, as you would see it, remove the extremist elements? Turkey wants more time? Is that what you want? You want more time?
Let me finish. Now, while we are dealing with this issue about the radicals, I'm saying, but more importantly, we avoided another disastrous influx of the refugees to Turkey, maybe to Europe and the United States even. So number one. Number two, we already avoided the 90% of the ceasefire violation committed by both parties, and the regime and then the other groups. So that this is an effort. We will continue to work on that, and we will start some patrolling around Idlib to keep the eye on the ceasefire and the movement of some radicals. And we will work together, and I believe that we will get rid of all of them over there as well. But after just one note, related to the previous discussion, at the moment, just to reiterate, we are hosting almost 4 million refugees from Syria, including the Kurds, Arabs, Yazidis, Assyrians, even the Armenians in Turkey now, hosted by Turkey, and almost we spent $35 billion. So this is our approach. We are approaching the issue purely from humanitarian point of view. Okay. So it is not a matter of the occupation or something, or the gaining some territory. As my colleague mentioned, already we have the MOU between us and Syria to fight against the terrorists. Because of the current situation, known situation, Syria, cannot fight against those terrorists. So this is the reason why we are there, why we are fighting. And then please remember whatever we did within the Jarablus, Elbab, Azaz, Afrin, yes. And then yes, we cleaned all of those areas, not for us, but for the Syrian people. Already 300,000 people already came back their homes.
Okay. So you have concerns, Lebanon as well has concerns about millions of refugees, and so does Jordan. It is a huge humanitarian concern. Let's broaden out this discussion to look at Syria's future. Since 2012, there has been a Geneva Agreement which said that there has to be a future for Syria which includes all Syrians. Even though militarily, the President Assad's forces, the Syrian government, is in control of the vast majority of territory, and the Syrian opposition has lost its ability to win this war militarily. There is a Syrian political opposition. There have been, I think, 9 failed efforts to try to get the sides together around the negotiating table. But not to be defeated, the United Nations has a new special representative of the Secretary General, the 4th Syria envoy, a very distinguished and experienced Norwegian diplomat. He's going to set the stage for us which lies ahead in an overall Syrian solution, which will include all of these problems we've been discussing. Please welcome Geir Patterson, who will speak to us. Microphone.
Thank you, Liz. No pressure. Absolutely. Listen, I think it's important that I start with the obvious fact that the only reason why I'm here is that for the UN there's only one interest, and that is the interest of the Syrian people. And then let me make, if you allow me, let me make only 3 brief points. Let me remind you about what is my mandate. My mandate is Security Council Resolution 2254. And all the gentlemen sitting here, they have agreed on that. And the Syrian parties have agreed on that. So what are the key elements of 2254? Well, we already heard the obvious point, and that is, of course, Syrian sovereignty, Syrian territorial integrity, and independence. But from there it goes down and it describes the suffering of the Syrian people, the challenge of terror, but then it says something very important, and that is this conflict can only be sorted out through negotiations. There is no military solution. And the parties agrees to that. And it also states that the negotiations should be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, but facilitated by the United Nations. So the big question then, of course, has become, how do we bring the parties together? And I will get to that. Then the resolution outlines all the socio-economic challenges, the question of refugees, IDPs, the question of reconstruction, the question of all the people that have been detained, missing persons, and hold to try to build confidence and trust. So I'm saying all the elements needed to bring a solution to the Syrian conflict, you can still find in that resolution, Security Council Resolution 2254. Then, Liz, if you allow me, let me say just a couple of words about sort of how do I see the situation. Well, you described a new reality, and I, of course, have to accept that as the fourth envoy, yes, I'm meeting a very different reality from what Lakhdar Brahimi met, from what Kofi Annan did, and, excuse me, and Staffan de Mistura. And I think your description is absolutely right, but we have to remind ourselves that there are still huge challenges. We have been discussing Idlib, 3 million people, still not under the control of the government, with a huge challenge of terror, and how to avoid the humanitarian disaster. We have been discussing the Northeast, enormous challenges still, maybe 2 to 3 million people, not under the control of the government. Then, of course, we have all the IDPs. We have 5.6 million refugees living in Jordan, living in Turkey, and, of course, in Lebanon, and a few also in Europe. So the question is then, what can we do to bring an end to this suffering? Well, the good news is the following, and we should remind ourselves about this, and that is that we actually do have an agreement on something, and that is we have an agreement that we will start working on the constitutional process in Syria. We have agreed that we actually have an agreement that the opposition have nominated 50 people to sit in that constitutional committee. The government has nominated 50 people to sit in that constitutional committee, and then we're working on 50 people from civil society that should also come together, and we are working on that, and we're working on the rules of procedure. So my hope is that this process, if we get that started, could be a door opener to a political process where we in parallel will have to work on issues of building trust and changing the realities on the ground in Syria. We need a real reconciliation in Syria, and that, in my opinion, we have to work on, as I said, in parallel. Is this possible? Yes, it's possible. But what do I need? Of course, I need the cooperation, most importantly, of the two parties. And so far, they have received me very well. I had very good discussions in Damascus. I had very good discussions with the opposition when I met with them, but I also need the gentlemen here and their cooperation. I need the P5, I need the Security Council, I obviously need Turkey, I need Iran, I need the Arab League, and I need a new sort of international agreement on how to move this process forward based on Security Council Resolution 2254. And I need the support of the Syrian people. Then I'm home and safe and dry. Thank you.
But just stay with us for a minute, Gerd Peterson. I mean, Lakhdar Brahimi, who sadly time and again would apologize for apologizing yet again to the Syrian people because he felt the United Nations and the rest of the international community had failed the people of Syria. And you'll remember when Kofi Annan, bless him, resigned, he said he was resigning because the two parties, the Syrian opposition and the government, were not showing willingness to go along with his efforts, but also he was very critical of the UN Security Council, that it had been as much of an obstacle. You've now taken over in 2019. You've said you need the support. You've been briefed. You've been to many capitals. Do you sense now that you will get the support that Kofi Annan, that Lakhdar Brahimi, and that Staffan de Mistura sadly did not have?
You don't expect me to answer no.
Well, the gentlemen are here. I mean, this is your opportunity. Yes.
But Liz, this is a serious question.
Yes.
And as you rightly stated out, there is a new reality. And I'm trying to discuss, both with my American friends, my Russian friends, with the Arab League, with Turkey, with Lebanon, with Iran. I was in Tehran as well. And, there is still a commitment to 2254. But as you know better than I, there is a deep, deep divide within the international community, a deep mistrust. So the question is it possible to get together on the Syrian file and to define what are our common interests? And I do believe that when it comes to Syria, there are actually a lot of common interests that we could work on and put aside the other things. And I will continue to emphasize this and hope that when we get the political process together in Geneva again, that we will see a united international community behind the UN and support us in that process. But don't ask anything more now.
Yes. Weeks, months? When should we expect you to be in Geneva?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible. Thank you very much, Geir Patterson. We wish you well in a very... When Kofi Annan took on the job in 2012, he said it was mission impossible. And then when Lakhdar Brahimi took over, he described it as mission nearly impossible. We hope it's a mission that is possible for the sake, most of all, of Syrians. All the gentlemen here have I think because the views which matter most of all are the views of Syrians. And I know we have a tradition that the young leaders should ask the first question, but I think they would agree with me that the first question should go to a Syrian, who's a distinguished gentleman who's come from Damascus. He has a question for us, and please identify yourself.
The bishop, I told you about it.
And please make it a question, not
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm Patriarch Ephraim, the second of the Syrian Orthodox Church, and I live in Damascus. I'm here for the second time, the conference at the invitation of the Hans Seidel Foundation. I had to drive from Damascus to Beirut and fly to Frankfurt and then to Munich. And this hard journey is nothing comparing to the suffering of the Syrian people who are suffering on a daily basis. We are VIP, we can get assistance we need, but the average people do not get that. The suffering is because of the situation, but also because of the unjust sanctions imposed on the Syrian people. And the Syrian people are the ones who are suffering most of these sanctions. My question is, where is the interest of the Syrian people in all that is happening now and the international community involvement in this? Is the interest of the Syrian people a priority? I wish it is. That's not my feeling, but I hope it is. We see many parties playing their role there, but we don't. I mean, look at this distinguished panel here. There are no Syrians here to talk about their country. One of the premises and the promises of the so-called Arab Spring in our region was to usher in a new era of democracy that would be probably Western-style democracy, which would mean people deciding their own future and way of governance. The Syrian people are not allowed to say what they want so far. While we emphasize the necessity of a political solution for the Syrian crisis and the return of all Syrian refugees and IDPs to their homes, I wish to ask the parties here and the parties involved in the Syrian crisis to help us with three main issues.
Keep it very briefly, please.
Yeah, very brief. The fate of the two missing archbishops of Aleppo, Bulus Yazgi and Yohanna Ibrahim. I don't believe there is no one who doesn't know something about them. There must be someone who knows something about them. I hope they will help us. The second issue is removing the unilateral and illegal sanctions because they are not imposed by the UN. Third point is allowing the Syrian people to decide their own future through legal and democratic ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know there are other Syrians attending. I'm going to take the privilege of the floor to say if there is another Syrian with us who would like to ask a question. No. I think we